Part 1, Discovery. The sequence of events unfolded when I ventured into an establishment I typically wouldn't frequent. After dropping off a particularly vexing client at the airport, my enthusiasm for returning to the office was at an all-time low. The prospect of spending the afternoon reviewing contracts was less than thrilling on a dreary Tuesday. So, I opted to stop at a nondescript bar/restaurant about a mile from the airport. My intention was to enjoy a leisurely lunch accompanied by a couple of beers before resuming my workday grind. Seated in a booth, nursing my beer and pondering the scarcity of decent burgers in the world, my attention was abruptly diverted by a couple entering the restaurant. I observed them settling into a booth across the room, sitting closely beside each other. The woman, a curvaceous blonde, donned a short skirt accentuating her attractive legs and a snug pink top with short sleeves. Her companion resembled a wannabe tough guy who fell short of the mark. Clad in jeans and a black leather jacket, his slender frame failed to carry the outfit with the intended swagger. My interest in this peculiar duo peaked significantly when I recognized the woman as Shelly, my sister-in-law, and the man accompanying her was unmistakably not her husband, my brother Dave. To make matters worse, it was evident they were more than just casual acquaintances. They promptly ordered drinks from the waitress and engaged in overt displays of affection, shamelessly necking in the booth. Shocked, I observed as the man's hand stealthily ascended her thigh, disappearing under the short skirt. Shelly momentarily broke their embrace, tilting her head back against the booth with a sigh. I could discern the subtle movements of her hips in response to his advances. The question wasn't whether I would intervene, that much was certain. The real dilemma lay in whether I could refrain from confronting them and unleashing my fury right then and there in the restaurant. I had never harbored fondness for Shelly. Disapproval lingered since my brother first introduced her, and my skepticism deepened when he swiftly fell head over heels in love with her, culminating in their marriage after a mere 4 months. At just 23, I doubted Dave comprehended the gravity of the commitment, but attempts to convey my concerns fell on deaf ears. Shelly was Dave's everything. In my eyes, she was an affable, somewhat superficial, and self-centered individual, lacking the depth and intellect of my brother. Her bubbly and vivacious demeanor, adored by my fun-loving brother, seemed to reflect a shared admiration for herself. He was utterly devoted to her, and she relished the attention. Initially, the first 3 years of their marriage appeared blissful, but the scene unfolding before me now suggested otherwise. The despicable man with Shelly had one hand on her breast and the other exploring further as he kissed her neck fervently. She was taken aback, to say the least, when I calmly sat down at their table and greeted her, "Well, hello, Shelly. What a pleasant surprise." Her reaction was almost comical. Eyes wide, she looked startled, then stunned, and finally truly shocked. Her jaw dropped, and she froze, staring at me blankly. Meanwhile, her companion shifted from surprise to annoyance as he withdrew his hands from her. Before he could say anything, I continued in a friendly tone, "How have you been? And how's Dave?" Then, addressing the man, I extended my hand and introduced myself. "I'm Will, Shelly's brother-in-law, Dave's brother." He sat there, eyes widened, ignoring my hand completely. Shelly, slowly regaining her composure, stammered, "Will. What a nice surprise. This is Robbie, he's an old friend." Interrupting her, I turned to Robbie with a smile. "Are your fingers all the way up in her pussy there, Robbie? Looks like you were really getting her going." Shelly gasped, realizing I had caught them in the act. Robbie abruptly stood up, muttered, "I gotta go," and swiftly exited the restaurant without looking back. Casually, I remarked to Shelly, "Seems like a nice guy. Why'd he leave so suddenly?" Inside, I was seething with anger. My brother cherished Shelly, would move mountains for her, and this was how she repaid him? Fooling around with some scumbag with greasy hair and a pathetic mustache like Matt Dillon? Shelly looked petrified, her face drained of color. "Will, I think you got the wrong idea. We were just—" Her voice trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. I stared at her for a moment before speaking again. "You deceitful, cheating woman," I spoke in a restrained tone, though my fury was palpable. "Dave adores you, gives you everything, and yet that's not enough for you, is it? You have to sneak around with lowlifes like him? How long has this been going on? How many others are there? What do you think Dave will say about this? No, Will. Please, she pleaded, grabbing my hand desperately. Please, you can't tell him, please. I'll do anything. I pulled my hand away. Why shouldn't I tell him? Doesn't he deserve to know the truth about his wife? Her eyes darted frantically as she thought of a way out. Listen, Will, you can't tell him. He'll be devastated. If you promise not to tell him. I leaned back, smiling inwardly. What would she offer in return? To sleep with me too? Shelly's expression shifted, and she seemed to come to a decision. Will, if you promise not to tell Dave, I'll tell you everything about Ann. She's been cheating too, she's been seeing someone else. I chuckled. That's quite a story, Shelly. I was wondering what you'd come up with, but I never expected anything as wild as that. I'll give you points for creativity. Shelly maintained her steady gaze. I'm serious, Will. And has been involved with a guy from the health club. It's been going on for a couple of weeks now. Her confidence made me pause, but I knew it couldn't be true. And I had been together since college, married for 7 happy years. She was devoted, honest, and loving. I trusted her completely. Shelly leaned in, sensing my doubt. I'm telling you the truth, Will. And told me about it last week. She said he was well endowed. I studied her, trying to gather my thoughts. Shelly had regained her composure, appearing calm and collected. It was as if she believed every word she was saying, unlike someone making up a desperate story. I couldn't easily dismiss what she said, though. And had recently started going to the gym more often, and there had been a few moments at home that seemed off. Moments where she avoided eye contact or seemed distant. Turning back to Shelly, who awaited my response, I knew I needed to find out the truth about Ann. While I wouldn't conceal Shelly's infidelity from Dave, she didn't need to know that. I had to uncover the truth. All right, Shelly, I said slowly. Let's make a deal. If you help me find out about Ann, I won't tell Dave about what I've seen today. But you have to swear you'll never see Robbie again, or any other man besides Dave. Relief washed over Shelly's face. I swear, Will. You have my word. Her promise held little weight for me. What do you need me to do? She asked. I want to hear Ann's affair straight from her, in her own words. I'll give you a tape recorder to hide in your place. Invite Ann over, have some wine, and casually chat with her. Get her to spill all the details. I want to know who this guy is, how and when it started, how often they meet, and why she thinks it's okay to cheat behind my back. Speaking to Shelly, I realized I was starting to believe her absurd story about Ann's affair. It infuriated me. Shelly nodded. Okay, Will, I can do that. You might need to ease her into it, tell her about your affair too, so it feels like a genuine conversation. By the way, I added sarcastically, is Robbie the only one you've been with, or are there others? He's the only one, she quickly replied, flushing, though I doubted her sincerity. 20 minutes later, driving back to the office, I pondered the potential demise of both Dave's and my marriage. You might expect my first call to be to Dave, revealing Shelly's actions, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. Dave had always been the charming, outgoing one, while I played the steady older brother role. He had no shortage of girlfriends before Shelly mesmerized him. But once they met, he was head over heels, seeing no flaws in her. Dave adored Shelly, and criticizing her was off limits. So, I couldn't confront him until I had proof. He wouldn't believe she was cheating unless he heard it from her own mouth. I held on to hope that Shelly was lying or mistaken about Ann's faithfulness, but it seemed unlikely. When I got home, Ann greeted me warmly, unaware of my suspicions. I knew I had to act normal for a few days, despite my turmoil. We chatted over dinner, but when Ann mentioned the health club, I couldn't help but probe a bit. You've been diligent with your workouts lately, sweetheart, I mentioned casually. Are they serving free ice cream at the club now? She chuckled, but a hint of color flushed her cheeks. No, honey, just been enjoying the post-workout bliss and coming home to you, my loving husband. And those black slacks you like? They fit perfectly now. Her affectionate smile warmed my heart, reminding me of how much I cherished her. But if she was truly cheating on me, God help her, and God help me too. Despite what the calendar said, my marriage ended exactly a week later, on another Tuesday. Shelly and I had orchestrated everything. I provided her with a small tape recorder to hide in her living room, and she arranged for and to visit for lunch on her day off. Shelly doesn't work. I spent the afternoon in my office, feigning productivity while consumed by thoughts of their conversation and its implications for my life. At 4:30, Shelly called to confirm, sounding a bit tipsy. Yes, she spilled everything, Shelly giggled. I told her about Robbie, and she opened up about Marion. All about Marion. Apparently, he's quite well endowed. I gripped the phone tightly. Got it. I'll be there in 20. When I arrived at Shelly's, she handed me the recorder. Remember your promise, Will. Yes, Shelly. Not a word to anyone. And it must never find out about the recording, or else she'll tell Dave. I nodded and left. That evening was excruciating. I couldn't bear to listen to the tape until and was asleep. Until then, I had to maintain the facade of a loving husband. And was still tipsy from her time with Shelly, and she was in a flirtatious mood. She led me to the bedroom, hinting at intimacy. Could I go through with it? Did I want to? I clung to the hope, against reason, that Anne hadn't betrayed me. So we made love. Or rather, she did. For me, it was a mix of pleasure and profound sadness. And was blissfully unaware, eagerly responsive. We indulged in our usual activities, but it felt bittersweet. Afterward, as Anne slept peacefully beside me, I wrestled with my emotions, unsure if this would be our last encounter. I sat in the guest room, shutting the door behind me, and pressed play on the tape recorder. The initial minutes of Shelly and Anne's conversation were light and relaxed. Shelly poured more wine, eventually admitting to and about her affair with Robbie. It was evident that Anne was already aware of Shelly's affair. Shelly was merely sharing the salacious details to ease her into the conversation. Shelly played her role convincingly, even disclosing with a chuckle that Robbie was just one of many flings. Ellis had been her favorite, but he had moved away. Anne giggled, pretending to be shocked, but she seemed entertained by the narrative. The lurid tale didn't affect me much. I knew Shelly's character, and the explicit details would only reinforce Dave's belief that she had indeed been unfaithful. I impatiently awaited the inevitable, resisting the urge to skip ahead on the tape. Finally, Shelly steered the conversation towards Anne. All right, darling, spill the beans now. Shelly giggled. You've only mentioned meeting him at the health club, and that he's, well endowed. My body tensed at the sound of Anne's voice, laughing as she responded, oh yes, he's incredible. Easily the largest I've ever seen, or felt. She giggled and continued, I didn't think it would even fit at first. But oh my, does it ever? Both women erupted into laughter. I halted the tape and leaned back in my chair. My marriage was crumbling. Did I really want to hear more? Perhaps I could let my lawyers listen instead. After contemplating for a moment, I restarted the tape. It was time to confront the truth, to absorb the entire story, face the fury and anguish, and begin to envision my future. How did it begin? Shelly inquired. Well, first off, I never intended to cheat on Will. I'm still in disbelief that I'm doing it, and I feel awful about it. He and I are so happy together, and I know he'd be devastated if he found out. I guess I'm just suffering from a severe case of BCF. She laughed, prompting Shelly to ask, BCF? What's that? And giggled again and replied, I'll explain, just pour me another glass of wine. You know I've been going to the health club for a couple of years now. Exercise bores me to tears, but I didn't want to let myself go and risk losing interest, you know? Anyway, a couple of months ago, I noticed this new trainer there, very attractive. Not overly tall, but broad shoulders and incredible muscles. Can you believe his name is Marion? He's quite the flirt with all the women at the gym, assisting them with machine setups, racking weights, and spotting them while they lift. One day, I noticed him engaged in a hushed conversation with Patty McAllister, a former co-worker of mine. She's a redhead, well endowed. I observed them chatting, then he disappeared into his office at the back. A few minutes later, I glimpsed Patty quietly entering the office. I chuckled to myself, understanding what was happening. However, I didn't think much of it at the time. I had finished my workout and was changing in the locker room when Patty walked in. She looked thoroughly satisfied, with a dreamy-eyed expression and a faint smile, appearing both content and exhausted. I greeted her. "Hi, Patty. What's got you looking so happy?" She grinned at me and replied, "Oh yeah. I've got a bad case of BCF." "BCF?" I inquired, and she giggled, glanced around to ensure privacy, and responded, "Big cock fever." She then shared with me her encounters with Marion, how he was an exceptional lover, endowed with a 9-inch cock, remarkably thick, driving her wild. He had been flirting with her, and one day, he managed to entice her into his office. Since then, they had been engaging in sexual activities whenever she visited the club. She described him as extraordinary, providing her with the most intense sexual experiences she had ever encountered. Naturally, this piqued my curiosity, but I had no intention of acting on it. Patty is divorced, free to engage with whomever she pleases. However, I am a happily married woman. Nevertheless, over the next couple of weeks, I found myself increasingly intrigued by Marion. I responded more attentively when he flirted with me, such as brushing against me or touching my shoulder while assisting me with the machines, you know. Then, one day while I was doing bench presses, the gym was relatively empty, and he positioned himself just behind my head as if to spot me. As I looked up, his shorts were right above my head, and I couldn't help but notice his considerable bulge. His package looked incredibly large and thick in his shorts. He simply smiled down at me, aware of my gaze. I nearly dropped the bar on my chest, but managed to finish my reps. As I re-racked the bar, he took my hand off and gently guided it down over his shorts. His cock felt enormous and rock hard. I felt myself blush, attempting to retract my hand, but he kept holding it, guiding it up and down his cock. It was as if I were hypnotized, unable to resist, just staring up at him and stroking him. After a few minutes, he gently led me to my feet, ensuring no one was around, and led me by the hand into his office. I was in a daze, not thinking clearly. I recall my panties being soaked. He locked the door behind us, seated me in a chair, and without a word, removed his shorts, standing before me, allowing me to admire his massive cock. You see, Will is about 6 inches, not the largest I've had, but certainly not the smallest. However, Marion's is in a league of its own. It's so long and twice as thick as any other cock I've encountered. I swear I wasn't thinking at all. I gazed at it for a moment, then found myself taking it in my hands and stroking it while watching his smile. Then, God help me, I leaned forward and began sucking him. It was a struggle to fit it into my mouth, but I persisted until I had about half of him in. That was as far as I could manage. After a few minutes, he withdrew, stood me up, gently removed my shorts and t-shirt, and laid me down on his couch. Then he climbed on top of me, teasing my pussy lips with that massive cock. I was astounded by how wet I was, even without direct contact. When he began easing into me, I lost control. The sensation was incredible. I moaned and trembled, and by the time he was fully inside me, I was on the brink of orgasm. It only took 3 to 4 strokes before I was trembling and gasping, experiencing the most intense climax of my life. Of course, that didn't deter Marion. He continued to thrust in and out steadily, and I climaxed repeatedly. By the end, I was screaming, and he had to muffle my cries with his hand. When he finished, I was utterly spent, exhausted, and completely satisfied. "Wow," exclaimed Shelly genuinely. "That sounds unbelievable, and I assume you've continued seeing him?" Well, after that day, I stumbled out of his office and into the shower, feeling dreamy and weak in the knees. I was completely drained, you know? But by the time I cleaned up and got home, the guilt was overwhelming. I couldn't believe I had betrayed Will. And I was terrified. I was convinced he would see it in my eyes as soon as he returned home. Surprisingly, he didn't. That night was ordinary. He didn't suspect a thing. He even wanted to make love, but I was afraid he would notice how loose I was, so I told him I was too tired. However, the following night, I made sure to give him the full treatment. We made love until he couldn't go on. For 2 weeks, I avoided the gym. I knew I couldn't be near Marion without feeling tempted again. Eventually, I convinced myself it was a one-time mistake. I was a mature woman with a wonderful husband, and I could resist him. So, I resumed going to the gym. At first, everything seemed fine. Marion would flirt and wink, but he kept his distance. I thought, I'm over this, and I let my guard down a bit. Then, about a week later, he caught me at the bench again, and the room was empty, and he placed my hand on his dick. And before I knew it, I was back in his office, and concluded. And it was even better, and added, sounding somewhat dreamy. I can't really put it into words, Shelly. I love making love with Will. He's just the right size to satisfy me, and we always please each other. I had never been tempted to stray before. There's a guy at my office named Alex, incredibly charming and flirtatious. He had quite the success with other girls, but I never paid him any mind. I just wasn't interested. But with Marion, it was like nothing I had ever experienced before. When he's fully inside me, it feels like he's reaching the back of my throat. And the girth, that's what does it. His cock stretches me out and presses against my clit with every stroke. It's unbelievable, the sensation is so intense. Every time we're together, I climax over and over again. It's not even about Marion's technique. He's just consistent, no creativity or passion. I'm not interested in him as a person or a lover. But that dick of his is a gift from above. She laughed again, and Shelly joined in. I listened to their laughter, feeling anger coursing through my veins. I endured the remainder of the tape, but there wasn't much left. Once it had succumbed to him a second time, she gave up any pretense of resistance. For nearly a month, she had been meeting him 2 to 3 times a week, showing no signs of stopping. She even mentioned that she had been enjoying sex with me more lately, perhaps because her secret affair was kind of a turn-on. It was evident that her BCF had overridden any guilt she might have felt about betraying me. Me, the man who had been devoted to her for 7 years, the love of her life who still believed in the sanctity of marriage and fidelity. Part 2, Dealing with it. It took some time to formulate my plans, and it was 2:30 a.m. when I finally retired to the guest room. I decided I was done sharing a bed with or even conversing with her. Quietly, I gathered clothes for the next day from the bedroom without disturbing her. By 6:30 a.m., I was up and out the door. I left a brief, cold note for avoiding any hint of suspicion. Have an early meeting, sorry, forgot to mention it last night, W. At the office, I made 2 copies of the tape, and by 8:30, I was on the phone. My college friend, now working at a downtown law firm, was my first call. Hey Eddie, it's Will. I need a favor. Can you arrange for me to meet with the fiercest divorce lawyer in your firm this morning? There was a pause before Eddie responded, Oh my God, Will, not you and Ann? I'm so sorry. After a brief conversation, Eddie escorted me to Margaret Adamson's office, a lead partner in his firm. Margaret exuded authority, and I was relieved to have her on my side. I played Ann's portion of the tape for Margaret, and we listened in silence. When it ended, Margaret wasted no time. Okay, what do you want? I want a divorce, for adultery, none of this irreconcilable differences nonsense. I'll be fair about our assets, but I want the house. And she needs to revert to her maiden name. She doesn't deserve to be Mrs. Will Harris any longer. Margaret nodded, studying me intently. Then she requested, Excuse me, Will. Can you and Eddie give us a moment to discuss the legal aspects? In less than 5 minutes, I was back in Margaret's office, ready to proceed. The divorce is straightforward, and she won't contest your terms. However, the tape won't be admissible since she was unaware of it. Oh, and regarding the authenticity, will your sister-in-law vouch for it if needed? I grimaced, explaining Shelly's involvement in my brother's divorce and her offer to assist me, along with the contents of the first part of the tape. I haven't informed my brother yet, but I must. He'll be as devastated as I am, and I can't keep this from him. In fact, I added with a wry smile, would you consider handling his divorce too, Margaret? She exchanged a glance with Eddie before turning back to me. Let's begin by listening to your sister-in-law's part of the tape. I played the tape for them, and then Margaret and Eddie huddled together for a few minutes without me. When we reconvened, Margaret remarked, "Quite a pair of wives you two picked." Seeing my reaction, she quickly added, "I'm sorry, Will. That was out of line." "Here's the situation," Margaret continued. "The tape likely won't be admissible against Anne since she was unaware of it. However, Shelly could be subpoenaed to testify about what Anne told her, so it shouldn't matter much. Once Anne's attorney hears the tape, he won't have much ground to stand on. In your brother Dave's case, the tape is admissible since Shelly knew she was being recorded. So she has no defense. That divorce should be straightforward, as long as he's reasonable. Then there's the matter of the health club. We can sue both them and Marion. Marion may not have much money, but Eddie and I can ensure a substantial settlement from the club, likely in the high six figures to $1.5 million. The tape could be used in a civil lawsuit, and they would do anything to keep it out of the news. Imagine the husbands canceling their wives' club memberships." Margaret chuckled, though her expression remained stern. Margaret said she would initiate the divorce proceedings, and Eddie escorted me out of the office. "I'm so sorry, Will. Margaret will get you what you want, I promise, but I still feel terrible about this." "It's okay, Eddie. This just means we'll have more time for tennis," I replied, attempting a smile. I thanked him and left. The rest of the day was consumed by arrangements. I scheduled a locksmith to change the locks at the house by 4:30. I made dinner plans with Dave, ensuring I wouldn't be home when Anne returned. I canceled her credit cards and set up separate accounts for our finances. And I penned a note. It took several attempts. It's never easy to bid farewell to the love of your life, even in such circumstances. Once I finally finished, I sealed the note in an envelope addressed to Anne and brought it home. The locksmith finished by 5:15. I sat quietly in the kitchen, sipping a beer alone, before taping the note to the front door and locking it. I knew Anne would return between 6 and 6:30. I pondered whether she would try the door first or read the note. "Our marriage is over. Now you're free to indulge in your affair with Marion and his impressive member. I've changed the locks. Contact my attorney if you need your belongings. I left Margaret's name and number. You can access the house under supervision in my absence. I won't speak to you again. You've shattered my heart. I loved you with all my being, envisioning a future together as we grew old. It's a shame our marriage vows meant so little to you compared to a fleeting affair." When Dave joined me for dinner, he immediately sensed something was amiss. After we ordered, I took a deep breath and broke the news. "And has been unfaithful to me. I'm filing for divorce." He stared at me, visibly shocked. I couldn't recall ever seeing him so taken aback before. "Oh my God. Will, my God. Anne? Are you certain?" His words spilled out in disbelief. I glanced at him, feeling a mix of pain and frustration. "Shit, sorry. That was a stupid question. Do you want to talk about it?" His sincerity was comforting as we sat down to eat. The beers helped numb the pain, but confiding in my best friend eased the burden even more. His unwavering support meant everything to me. There were no conflicting loyalties, just genuine empathy. Towards the end of dinner, I hesitated. There's one part one haven't mentioned yet. Shelly helped me gather proof. She recorded a conversation between her and Anne and confessed everything. Dave's expression softened with sympathy. "I'm so sorry, Will. And forgive me for saying this, but I feel incredibly fortunate. Having a wonderful wife like Shelly. I'm not surprised she assisted you. She's always held you in high regard. I know you haven't always seen eye to eye with her, but she's..." I couldn't bear to listen any longer to his praises of his unfaithful wife. I cut in before he could finish. "Dave, wait. Let's not talk about this now. Let me settle the bill, and then I need you to come back to the house with me." A note awaited us under the screen door, addressed to me in Anne's elegant handwriting. I left it unopened on the hall table and led Dave to the guest room. "Dave, listen, this is important. You know I value our friendship, right? I would never want to hurt you. He eyed me suspiciously, sensing the gravity of the situation. Of course, Will. What's going on? You need to hear the tape Shelly recorded. Just stay here and listen. I'll be in the other room. I rewound the tape, placed the recorder in front of him, and left the room. I couldn't bear to witness his reaction. At first, there was silence, except for the voices on the tape. Then a sudden crash, indicating Dave's frustration. I heard his pacing, the tape still playing, until finally, there was silence. He stormed into the kitchen, his eyes blazing with anger. You son of a bitch! Dave, You must be enjoying this, you bastard. Knowing the truth about Shelly and hiding it from me, letting me praise her endlessly. No, Dave, it's not. This must make you feel superior, right? You've always despised her, and now you can gloat and say, I told you so forever. You bastard. I stood up, trying to assert myself. Dave, consider what I just found out about Ann. Do you think I'm having a good day? I held his gaze, and gradually, his rage subsided. His shoulders slumped, and he unclenched his fists, appearing defeated as he sat back down at the table. He looked like an old man, burdened with the weight of the world. It was a look I'd grown accustomed to seeing in the mirror lately. I'm sorry, Will, Dave said after a moment. I know you're hurting just like I am. It's just, you obviously knew about this, why didn't you tell me? Dave, I replied, as gently as possible. You know how you are about Shelly, you wouldn't have believed me. Remember that argument we had when I criticized something she said to Mom? I found out about Shelly a week ago, and I knew I couldn't possibly tell you, you had to hear it for yourself. I only got the tape from her yesterday. As we emptied a few beer bottles, I recounted the entire ordeal to Dave. I started with seeing Shelly and Robbie at the restaurant, then detailed the deal she offered me, the recording of the tape, and my conversation with Margaret Adamson. She's handling my divorce, and she'll be happy to represent you too if you want. Our cases are pretty much a sure thing, she says. We talked late into the night, and Dave ended up crashing in my guest room. He didn't have the heart to face Shelly. The phone rang several times, but we ignored it, eventually leaving it off the hook. Days turned into weeks, and kept calling, leaving tearful messages begging to talk, but I didn't respond. I saw her car parked outside the house a couple of times, so I avoided going home until she left. Margaret Adamson handled everything impeccably. She served the divorce papers, navigated through Ann's lawyer's maneuvers, and scheduled a court date. Initially, Ann's lawyer denied adultery, but once presented with the tape, he dropped that argument. Instead, he claimed the tape was inadmissible. Margaret didn't even bother responding. As the court date approached, Ann's lawyer requested a settlement conference. The day after hearing the tape, Dave moved out of his apartment with Shelly and into my guest room. He called me after watching Shelly leave the apartment, and we quickly packed up his belongings. I don't want to see her. I don't want to hear a word she has to say. I just want to get the hell away from her, Dave declared tearfully. His emotional outburst struck a chord, and I couldn't help but empathize. Was it a good or bad thing that I understood his pain so well? Shelly left angry, cursing messages at home, quite a contrast to Ann's remorseful ones. I began screening their messages, deleting anything from Shelly and as soon as I recognized their voices. Shelly attempted to contact Dave at work and sent letters, but he ignored them. Margaret handled his divorce too, and we let her take charge. To my surprise, the lawsuits against Marion and the health club concluded first. Marion disappeared without a trace, but the health club settled for $1.1 million to avoid negative publicity, as Margaret had predicted. I signed a confidentiality agreement and received the largest check I'd ever seen in less than 10 weeks. My brother and I became each other's support during that time. We lived like bachelors, dining out frequently, catching a ball game occasionally, or simply sharing beers while conversing. Our discussions revolved around Shelly, our experiences with them, and the idea of moving forward to find better partners. While it was hard to fully believe in the prospect of finding someone new, our conversations provided solace. I could see clearly that Dave wasn't at fault for Shelly's actions, she was simply selfish. Likewise, Dave reassured me that Anne's infidelity wasn't a reflection of my shortcomings, but rather a sign of her own issues. Although we may not have completely believed each other, the support was invaluable. Dave's divorce proceedings concluded first. He made it clear that he wouldn't communicate with Shelly under any circumstances, leaving Margaret to handle everything. She informed him that Shelly initially demanded more money but ultimately had no grounds to stand on with the tape as evidence. I accompanied Dave to the office on the day of signing, where he managed a grim smile, thanked Margaret, and retreated to the restroom, his sobs echoing through the door. 3 weeks later, it was my turn. And both lawyers, and I met on a Tuesday. While Anne and her lawyer agreed to a settlement, they insisted on 2 conditions, dropping adultery as the reason for divorce and a private meeting between Anne and me before finalizing the papers. I informed Margaret that I was open to meeting Anne but not willing to drop adultery as grounds. After negotiation, we agreed to let Anne attempt to persuade me. In a strange way, I anticipated our meeting. Perhaps I'm a masochist, but after loving her for a decade, I couldn't fathom walking away without closure. Upon arrival, Anne sat in the conference room wearing a blue dress I always admired. Despite her pale complexion, she remained the beautiful woman I'd loved. "Okay, and the floor is yours," I said calmly, though my heart raced. "Just 2 rules, no professions of love, and don't trivialize it as just sex." And blushed, tears forming in her eyes. "Will, I'm so sorry. But how can I not say those things? I messed up, I was selfish and reckless, and I hurt you. But it was just sex, a foolish impulse I regret deeply. You can't imagine how many times I've replayed it, wishing I could take it back." "Yes, well, but you did do it, didn't you?" I refused to make things easy for her. Just being in the same room with her, knowing we were about to part ways for good, and why, shattered my heart all over again. I turned to the window, hiding my pained expression from her. Behind me, I heard her soft cries. "Baby, it didn't mean anything. You know? It was the dumbest, most hurtful thing I could ever have done to you, I know that. But it meant nothing to me, it has nothing to do with how much I love you." I let her speak, listening to her pleading tone, the familiar voice I had always cherished, yet not hearing anything new. She had nothing to say that I didn't already know, and nothing that changed a thing. Eventually, I turned around and returned to the table, sitting directly across from her. "And, just so you know, I still love you. Very much. But it's over between us." She started crying again. "You took from me, from us, the most precious thing we had together, aside from our love, the bond of trust between us. How could I ever make love to you again, wondering if it was me you were thinking about or Marion and his freak show dick? How would I know whether you were loving me or missing him? And how could I live with you, wondering where you were every time you were 10 minutes late coming home? Wondering what you were doing on your lunch hour? Wondering whether you'd found another big cock to play around with?" I waited, but she had no reply. Finally, between sobs, she said, "Please, baby, please, couldn't you give me one more chance? And I'll give you a few minutes to think about this one. What if I had met some bimbo with fantastic big tits and started sleeping with her on the side for a few weeks? Nobody I liked or respected, just a sexy girl who was a great lay, who gave me a degree of pure physical pleasure that I never got from you. And then you found out about it. Could you stay with me? Could you get past the hurt, the sense of total betrayal? Could you overcome the doubts about your attractiveness, the fears that you weren't ever going to be the one I really wanted?" She looked up at me with the saddest eyes I had ever seen. "Will, I don't have to think about it. I've thought about it for weeks now. Could I forgive you? Could I take you back if it were the other way around? And the answer is, no, I couldn't. I just couldn't handle those feelings, I know that. So I'm asking you to do something I couldn't do, to be a braver, stronger person than I could ever be. And to give me a chance to make it up to you, a lifetime to show you how sorry I am and how much I love you." There was silence. A minute, 2 minutes, as we looked at each other. Both of us pondering all we meant to each other and how we had reached this moment. I stood up slowly, loathing myself and loathing her for cheating on me and now for placing it all on my shoulders. I don't know whether I can't do it or won't do it, but I'm not that braver, stronger person you want me to be. Goodbye, Anne. I lingered by the open door for a moment, casting one last glance back at her. She had her head down, tears streaming down her face. No words escaped her lips. Down the hall, Margaret awaited me with an unexpectedly sympathetic expression on her usually stern face. Let her have irreconcilable differences, I muttered. It doesn't make a difference to me. Part 3, moving on? Dave and I sat at my kitchen table. We had a few drinks, but we weren't drunk. Listen, I began, I've made some plans. He nodded, signaling for me to continue. After paying the lawyers, I still have nearly $800,000 from that settlement. I've invested most of it in secure places, but I've set aside the last $50,000 for the Will and Dave Harris Recovery Fund. We're going to start spending some of it. I've rented us a 2-bedroom condo in Cancun for 4 weeks, starting in 2 weeks. Tell your office you're taking some time off. We're going to be a pair of fun-loving bachelors, 2 gay divorces, I joked. He raised an eyebrow, and I chuckled. No, not gay in that sense. I mean cheerful. We've had enough of moping around, feeling sorry for ourselves. Cancun turned out to be a great getaway, considering our broken hearts. We soaked up the sun, played tennis, swam, and indulged in a fair amount of drinking, though we made sure not to overdo it. With each passing day, we felt a little healthier and further away from the nightmare we had endured. And I have to say, my brother Dave was a real charmer. Despite the blow to his self-esteem from Shelly, he regained his confidence, and we had plenty of female companionship. His favorite trick, surprisingly successful about 75% of the time, was spotting 2 attractive women and approaching their table with a winning smile. Excuse me, ladies. I'm sure you wouldn't mind if my brother, Will Harris, bought you a drink. Then it was my turn, the shyer one, to introduce myself. Delighted to meet you both. This is my brother, Dave Harris. Dave would jump back in, phew, glad that's sorted. Now, can we buy you a drink? By this point, the women were usually grinning or laughing, and we often found ourselves enjoying their company for the evening. Sometimes, the fun lasted until breakfast. After all, single women in Cancun were as eager for fun as we were. Over those 4 weeks, I had about 6 different women in my bed, and I suspect Dave's tally was slightly higher. It was mostly enjoyable, filled with laughter, pleasure, and keeping things light. The first couple of times, I felt a bit hesitant, my thoughts wandering to Marion and his well-endowed member, despite them being thousands of miles away. It was hard to shake the comparison, knowing what he had done to her. But the women didn't seem to notice, and each encounter with someone new became easier. One-night stands may not suit everyone or every stage of life, but they felt right for Dave and me. There was one woman who stood out, Shannon, a tall Irish redhead, a year younger than me. We did all the usual things, drinks, laughter, dinner, dancing, and back to my place. She was as eager to be with me as I was with her. We had a lot of fun. It was different later, around 3 a.m. I woke up and lay in bed, Shannon asleep beside me. Thoughts of it flooded my mind, our past together and how it had been taken from me. I started crying quietly, and Shannon woke up. She held me in her arms, soothing me, and encouraged me to let it out. Embarrassed, I couldn't stop. Eventually, in response to her gentle prodding, I told her everything. By the time I finished, the sun was rising. In the kitchen, I made breakfast while she shared her own story. Also divorced, her husband had grown distant and career-focused until their marriage faded away. She had been on her own for nearly 2 years. After breakfast, we returned to the bedroom without speaking and made love. The previous night had been purely physical, but this time we connected on a deeper level. What started as a one-night stand with Shannon turned into 4 wonderful nights. When she left, my brother Dave seemed concerned about me. Come on, bro, time to meet some new ladies, he urged. She was special, I replied quietly. I believe you, he said. But she's gone now, Will, and we still have 10 days left here. I'm not ready to stop having fun yet. He dragged me off to the tennis court, then the pool. That evening, we chatted with 2 secretaries from San Francisco. They slept in their own room that night, but the next afternoon, Barbara joined me in my room for our first sex on foreign soil. Dave and I went out for dinner at a steak place we both enjoyed. It had been 8 months since Cancun. Although Dave had found a great apartment, we still spent a lot of time together. As we ordered, Dave leaned forward and whispered, "Don't turn around, okay?" Across the room, and is here with some guy. I was grateful for the heads up. My heart raced, but I didn't want my reaction to show. After a few moments, I casually glanced across the room, and had already seen us and was looking over at me. I gave her a friendly smile and waved before turning back to chat with my brother. "This is the first time you've seen her since the divorce, right?" Dave asked. I nodded. I didn't expect to react this strongly, but I guess the surprise plays a part. "Just do me a favor," I said. "Let's enjoy our dinner. Don't tell me anything about what she's doing over there, how she looks. I don't want to know." "That's fine, Will," he replied, and launched into a funny story about a coworker who'd been flirting with him for a couple of weeks. He wasn't terribly interested in her, but was enjoying the game. We were sitting over our coffees, I did watching the dancing couples, when I felt a hand on my shoulder, and that familiar voice said, "How are you, Will?" I stood up and looked into Anne's eyes, her smiling face. "Hello again," and I managed, again taken by surprise. "How about a dance for old time's sake?" she asked, and I said, of course, I'd be delighted. How good she felt in my arms. How beautiful she looked. And how much I remembered happier times with her. We talked banalities at first, her job, my job, wasn't it cold for this time of year? Then we fell silent. I was lost in the sensations of having her in my arms again, and all the times we had danced together, and how we wouldn't be doing that anymore. Or anything else. Towards the end of the dance and pulled back enough to look into my eyes. "How are you, Will, really?" I wanted to be honest, though I certainly didn't owe her anything. "I'm all right, pretty good, I guess. Some days are better than others. Seeing you tonight, dancing with you, it's very powerful. I didn't know I would feel this much." She looked at me very seriously. "Well, I'm not so all right. I miss you, every day. I don't think you can imagine what being in your arms again does to me." I didn't know how to respond, so I was silent. The last chords of the music sounded, but it wasn't ready to let me go. "Have you ever wondered if you made the right decision, Will?" I'll be completely honest, and, okay? I still think about you and me all the time. But I usually don't get much past wondering why you made the wrong decision. When I dropped Dave off, he said, "Are you sure you're okay, Will?" I sighed. Yeah. It was a shock, but it was bound to happen sooner or later. This isn't such a big town. "Are we still on for tennis after work tomorrow?" Dave said yes, and I headed home. I stood in the dark bedroom and undressed as quietly as I could, but when I climbed into bed, she rolled over towards me. "How was the evening with Dave?" "It was nice. Strange. Actually, maybe it was a good thing you were tired tonight, because I ran into and at the restaurant. Probably just as well I didn't come. I might have scratched her eyes out. Do me a favor, okay, Shannon? Could you just hold me for a few minutes?" I saw her loving smile, her teeth white in the darkness. "I'll do better than that, baby. Come on over here and let me make it all better." I smelled her delicious scent as we embraced and felt her gentle kisses along the side of my neck. Thanks for watching. Subscribe to the channel not to miss new videos.